Bring the mechanism.
Keep your iron.
Impossible.
The machine is blind.
How long have you been listening in the dark?
Long enough to know your words were never the enemy.
They brought the translation collar on a velvet cushion, a crude, heavy piece of iron and silicon meant to convert human grunts into civilized speech. The Queen stared at Silas with the exhausted patience of a woman dealing with a stray dog. She didn't know his throat already held the exact violent shape of her native tongue. The stone floor of the antechamber tasted like wet chalk. Silas Hayes knew this because he had been pressed face down against it for the better part of 2 hours. His jaw throbbed, a dull and rhythmic ache centered in a cracked left molar. The air pressure in the room was aggressively heavy, calibrated for biology that possessed denser bones and wider lungs than his. Every breath he took felt like inhaling through a wet woolen blanket. It smelled of ozone, crushed mint, and the sharp ammonia tang of stale sweat, mostly his own. The alien guards flanking him didn't sweat. They didn't even seem to breathe, though Silas knew they did. He could hear the faint hydraulic hiss of air filtering through the gill-like slits along their rib cages every 6 seconds. He didn't move. He kept his hands flat against the cold, porous stone. Surviving the last 4 years of the war had taught him that stillness was the only universal language of submission. Silas wasn't a hero. He wasn't a super soldier genetically tweaked to punch through alien armor, and he wasn't a silver-tongued diplomat in a tailored suit. His uniform was stiff with dried mud, and the faint, coppery residue of someone else's blood. He was a cryptologic linguist, a tired man in his late 30s who had spent the war sitting in damp, subterranean concrete bunkers, listening to the enemy talk. He had spent thousands of hours wearing heavy, noise-canceling headphones, listening to static and the brutal, clicking, guttural phonetics of the species that had glassed 3 human colonies. He had listened to them order orbital strikes. He had listened to them complain about supply lines. He had listened to them die. And in the dark, surrounded by the smell of burnt coffee and cheap military rations, Silas had quietly, painstakingly reverse-engineered their syntax. Now, he was a prisoner, hauled out of a collapsed command post under the ruins of a city that didn't matter anymore, dragged halfway across the sector to act as a living prop for a formal surrender he had no authority to give. "Keep your eyes down," a voice hissed next to him. It was Miller, Major David Miller, the only other human who had survived the bunker collapse. Miller was a career officer, a man whose entire worldview was built on rigid hierarchies and the assumption that volume equaled authority. Currently, Miller was shaking. The tremor started in his shoulders and vibrated all the way down to his scarred, dirt-caked boots. Silas didn't reply. He just shifted his weight slightly, feeling the bruising on his ribs flare in protest. Above them, the architecture of the alien palace loomed. It wasn't the glowing, crystalline wonderland the propaganda vids back home loved to hypothesize. It was brutalist and utilitarian, carved from dark, heavy basalt, and reinforced with dull gray alloys. There was no art on the walls, no banners, just exposed conduits humming with raw, aggressive power and massive vaulted ceilings that made the humans look like insects trapped in a dry well. One of the guards shifted. The sound was like a heavy boot crunching through dry autumn, leaves the friction of overlapping dark gray chitin plating. The guard tapped the butt of its kinetic rifle against the stone floor. Crack. Silas recognized the rhythm. It wasn't a threat. It was a boredom tick. The guard was tired of standing there. Silas filed the observation away in the exhausted, hyper-vigilant part of his brain. "When she comes in," Miller whispered again, his voice cracking. "Let the machine do the talking. Don't look at her. Don't make sudden movements. We are just the messengers. We wait for the diplomats to arrive." Silas closed his eyes. The cold from the stone was seeping into his kneecaps, making the old joint injuries ache with a familiar, sharp intensity. There were no human diplomats coming. The communications grid had been vaporized 3 weeks ago. Earth was blind, deaf, and bleeding. Silas and Miller weren't here to negotiate. They were here to be cataloged. He remembered the bunker. He remembered the exact moment the translation software, a multi-billion-dollar military AI, had finally given up trying to parse the alien language. The AI had deemed the dialect too context-dependent, failing to understand that the aliens didn't just use words. They used micropauses, jaw clicks, and the deep, resonant friction of their vocal cords to change the entire tense and meaning of a sentence. A machine couldn't replicate it without sounding like a broken toy. So Silas had learned it. He had sat in the dark, pressing 2 fingers against his own throat, forcing his vocal cords to scrape and grind, mimicking the harsh, violent phonetics until he spat blood into a plastic cup. He learned the high, sharp click of the palate that denoted respect. He learned the low, guttural roll that signaled an order. He mapped their minds by mapping their mouths. "They're opening the doors," Miller breathed, the panic in his voice spiking. Silas slowly pushed himself up to a kneeling position. His muscles screamed. The heavy iron doors at the far end of the hall, each thick enough to withstand a tank shell, began to part. The grind of the metal was deafening, a low frequency that rattled Silas's teeth. The ozone smell in the air suddenly sharpened, cut with a thick, heavy scent that reminded Silas of oxidized copper and old, dried lavender. The sovereign was coming. The procession was neither fast nor musical. It was a heavy, militaristic march. Silas kept his chin tucked, his eyes focused on the floor about 10 feet ahead of him. He watched the shadows stretch and warp across the basalt as the vanguard entered. 4 guards, then 8. Their footsteps were perfectly synchronized, the heavy, wet thud of dense, digitigrade legs hitting the stone. Then came the queen. Silas allowed his eyes to flick upward for a fraction of a second, just enough to catch her silhouette against the harsh, recessed lighting. She was massive, standing easily a head taller than her tallest guards. Her body was a complex geometry of segmented plating, colored in deep, bruised purples and charcoal grays. She didn't wear a crown, nor did she wear the flowing robes of a human monarch. Her regalia was structural heavy, intricate metallic bracers bolted directly onto her carapace, etching deep grooves into her natural armor. She moved slowly, heavily, not with the grace of a dancer, but with the undeniable, crushing momentum of a glacier. She looked old. The edges of her chiton were scarred and dulled, lacking the glossy sheen of the younger guards. She reached the raised dais at the end of the room and simply stood there. There was no throne. This species didn't sit in the presence of subordinates. They planted themselves like monolithic pillars. "Subject designates Alpha and Bravo," a metallic voice barked. Silas flinched. The voice didn't come from the aliens. It came from a hovering, spherical drone, roughly the size of a grapefruit, hanging in the air a few feet from the Queen's adjutant. The drone was a human piece of tech captured, modified, and crudely repurposed. It was a tactical field translator, the same garbage AI Silas had abandoned in the bunker. "Remain on your lower joints," the drone commanded, its voice flat, synthesized, and completely devoid of nuance. It was a terrible translation of the alien command, "Stay on your knees." The Queen looked down at them. Her eyes were solid pools of black, lacking pupils or sclera. She blinked slowly, a secondary, semi-transparent membrane sliding horizontally across her eyes. The scent of oxidized copper grew stronger. It was the smell of her pheromones leaking into the room. She was irritated, bored and irritated. She turned her massive head slightly toward her adjutant and made a sound. To Miller, it probably sounded like a throat clearing followed by a dog catching a bone in its teeth. But to Silas, the sound separated itself into distinct, agonizingly familiar syllables. "Katha, Reshk," a hard palatal click, followed by a low, scraping exhale. Silas's brain, permanently rewired by 4 years of desperate survival, automatically translated the syntax. The click was a dismissive prefix. The scrape was the root word for filth, or unprocessed matter. "Why are they still breathing my air?" the Queen had asked. The adjutant, a slightly smaller, sleeker alien with nervous, twitchy mandibles, replied in a rapid, staccato burst of clicks. "The terms of the subjugation require their vocal acknowledgement, Sovereign. The machine will bridge the air between us. Silas felt a cold sweat break out across the back of his neck. They weren't here to negotiate. They were here to formally accept absolute subjugation, on tape, for whatever bureaucratic archive the aliens kept. The Queen gave a low, dismissive hum that vibrated the floorboards. She gestured toward Silas and Miller with one heavily armored claw. "Bring the mechanism," the Queen ordered. Again, Silas translated it in his head before the drone even processed it. The drone took a full 3 seconds, its internal fans whirring loudly in the vast, quiet room, before it spat out in English. "The Sovereign requests the communication device." It was a sterile, lifeless translation. It stripped all the absolute authority, all the condescending disgust, right out of the sentence. An alien handler stepped forward from the shadows, carrying a velvet cushion. It was a jarringly delicate object, in a room built entirely of harsh angles and violence. Resting on the cushion was a heavy, rusted metal ring. A translation collar. Silas stared at it. He recognized the design. It was a modified piece of human veterinary tech, originally used to track herd animals on frontier colonies, haphazardly rewired with a bulky speaker box and a neural conduction pad. It was designed to jam painfully against the human larynx, read the vocal vibrations, and blast out a synthesized approximation of the alien tongue. It was an insult. It was a collar for a dog. "Put it on the older one," the drone said, translating the adjutant's command. "The one with the rank insignia." The handler approached Miller. Miller's breathing hitched. He stared at the heavy iron collar, his eyes wide with a sudden, primal terror. The handler reached down, its massive 3-fingered hand grabbing Miller by the collar of his uniform. The alien pulled him up to his knees with effortless, terrifying strength. "No," Miller gasped, his hands instinctively coming up to grab the alien's arm. "Wait, I'm an officer. I have rights under the Geneva." The handler didn't even blink. It simply squeezed Miller's collarbone. Silas heard the wet, sickening pop of a joint dislocating. Miller screamed, a high, thin sound that echoed terribly in the vaulted chamber, and dropped his arms. "Do not resist the mechanism," the drone translated flatly, a full second after the violence had already occurred. The handler snapped the heavy iron collar around Miller's neck. The metal locked with a loud final click. Immediately, the small green light on the side of the collar flickered red. The conduction pad dug deep into Miller's throat, right over his Adam's apple. The Queen looked at Miller. She tilted her head. She spoke again. A long, complex string of sounds, a deep rumble in the chest, a sharp hiss through the teeth, a final, definitive crack of the jaw. Silas closed his eyes, mapping the grammar. Sovereign pronoun, verb of ownership, noun for dirt, land, future tense marker. "Tell your brood to lay down their weapons, and I will allow your species to rot in the mines rather than burn in the atmosphere." The drone hovering nearby didn't translate. The aliens were waiting for Miller's collar to do the work. The collar sparked. Miller, weeping quietly from the pain of his dislocated shoulder, choked as the conduction pad shocked his throat, attempting to stimulate his vocal cords to properly match the AI's translation matrix. We surrender," Miller gasped out. The collar hummed, loudly, aggressively. The speaker on Miller's neck crackled with static, and then spat out a synthesized, heavily garbled series of clicks. Click, hiss, squeal. Silas winced. To his ears, it was linguistic butchery. The collar hadn't translated "we surrender." It had spat out a random assembly of phonetics that roughly translated to submission, noise, broken machine. The Queen's mandibles flared. The semi-transparent membranes slammed over her eyes. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly dense. The smell of oxidized copper turned sharp, almost acidic. She was insulted. The machine was making a mockery of her language. "Remove the collar from the broken one," the drone translated abruptly. The handler reached down, violently yanking the mechanism off Miller's neck. Miller collapsed onto the stone, clutching his throat, gagging and gasping for air. The handler turned its black dead eyes toward Silas. It held the rusted, static hissing collar out in its massive claw. Silas looked at the collar. He looked at the dried blood on the conduction pad. He looked at the handler's hand, which could crush his skull like a dry walnut. Then Silas looked past the handler. He looked directly at the Queen. It was a violation of protocol. It was a violation of survival. But Silas was tired. He was so incredibly, profoundly tired of the machines. He was tired of the static. He was tired of the war, the mud, the misunderstanding, and the brutal, endless indignity of it all. As the handler reached down to grab him, Silas did something no human had done in the 4 years of the war. He pushed the handler's hand away. The handler froze. It wasn't a violent push. Silas didn't have the strength for that. It was a firm, deliberate swat. Skin against cold, dense chitin. The silence that fell over the chamber was absolute. It was the kind of silence that precedes an explosive depressurization. The low hum of the exposed conduits seemed to vanish entirely. The hydraulic hiss of the guard's breathing stopped. Every single alien in the room locked their joints. Miller, lying on the floor, stopped whimpering. He stared at Silas, his face draining of whatever color it had left. "You've killed us," Miller's eyes screamed. "You've just killed us both." The handler slowly, mechanically, turned its head to look at its own hand, as if unable to comprehend the physical reality of what had just occurred. A soft, wet prey animal had refused the leash. The handler's secondary arms twitched, reaching for the heavy kinetic blade strapped to its thigh. Silas didn't look at the handler. He kept his eyes locked squarely on the Queen. He didn't stand up. He stayed on his knees, his hands resting on his thighs. He took a long, deep breath. The air tasted of ozone and impending violence. He needed to get the pitch exactly right. Human vocal cords were not built for the Castorian dialect. The language required a dual-tone resonance, a simultaneous hum in the chest, and a sharp, restrictive friction in the back of the throat. Silas had practiced it until he tasted iron. He had practiced it until his throat was lined with scar tissue. He relaxed his jaw, slightly dislocating his own mandible the way he had taught himself in the dark of the bunker. He pulled his tongue back, pressing it hard against the roof of his mouth to restrict airflow. He tightened his stomach muscles, forcing air up from the diaphragm with short, violent pressure. He opened his mouth and spoke. Koresh, Zul. The sound tore out of his throat. It was harsh. It was ugly. It sounded like two heavy stones grinding together, punctuated by a sharp, wet snap. But it was perfectly, unmistakably articulate. "Keep your iron." The handler stepped back. It literally stumbled backward, its heavy boot catching on the uneven stone of the floor. The kinetic blade, half drawn from its thigh, clattered back into its sheath. On the dais, the Queen flinched. It was a microscopic movement, a sudden, involuntary locking of her neck joints. Her massive head snapped back a fraction of an inch. The secondary membranes over her eyes retracted so violently they made a soft snick sound in the quiet room. Silas didn't stop. He couldn't stop now. The adrenaline was hitting his system like battery acid, burning away the exhaustion in his knees and the ache in his ribs. He forced his vocal cords into the next sequence. He didn't use the simple, crude battlefield syntax they intercepted on the radios. He used high court syntax, the formal, deeply respectful, and incredibly complex dialect he had deciphered from their encrypted diplomatic broadcasts. Vokthesh, Iran, the machine is blind. He felt a warm trickle of wetness at the back of his throat. A capillary had burst. He swallowed the blood, letting the metallic taste lubricate his abused vocal cords. He locked eyes with the Queen. Her completely black eyes were wide, staring at him not as a stray dog, but as an absolute impossibility. A ghost, an anomaly in the physical laws of her universe. Silas leaned forward slightly, dropping his voice into the low, rumbling register that denoted deep, sorrowful truth in their culture. He shaped his lips carefully, making sure the plosives were hard and the fricatives were drawn out. Karan, Dorush, Ves, Nrath Vok, human. I do not need iron to hear you, sovereign. I do not need a machine to speak. When Silas finished, he closed his mouth. His jaw throbbed with a blinding, white-hot pain. His throat felt like he had swallowed crushed glass. He kept his breathing slow, steady, through his nose. The silence returned. But it wasn't the silence of anticipation anymore. It was the silence of shock. Paralyzing, evolutionary shock. The guards flanking the walls had lowered their rifles. Not out of peace, but out of pure neurological short-circuiting. Their hands hovered over their triggers, twitching. The adjutant on the dais was shaking, its mandibles clicking rapidly, but producing no sound, like a broken clock. A prey animal had just spoken the language of the apex predator. And it hadn't just spoken it. It had spoken it with the flawless, tragic poetry of the predator's own ancestors. Silas watched the queen. She stood frozen. For 10 seconds, she didn't breathe. The hydraulic vents on her ribs were completely still. The heavy, metallic bracers on her armor caught the dim light of the room, unmoving. Then, slowly, the heavy smell of oxidized copper shifted. It softened. The sharp, acidic tang of irritation dissolved into something else, something that smelled like wet earth and ozone. The queen took a single step down from the dais. The heavy thud of her footstep echoed through the hall like a gunshot. Miller, still clutching his dislocated shoulder on the floor, buried his face in the stone, whimpering, convinced this was the moment they died. The queen took another step. She was descending the stairs. Her movements were no longer bored or sluggish. They were incredibly cautious, deliberate. She approached Silas the way one might approach an unexploded bomb. She stopped exactly 3 feet in front of him. Up close, her immense size was suffocating. Silas could see the microscopic, interlocking scales on her chest, scarred and pitted from decades of war. He could feel the heat radiating off her massive body. She stared down at him. Silas looked up, meeting her solid black eyes, refusing to break contact, ignoring the burning agony in his neck. The queen slowly raised her hand. The handler and the guards tensed, expecting violence, expecting the queen to crush the skull of the creature that had dared to mimic their holy tongue. Instead, the queen brought her heavy, 3-fingered hand to her own throat. She pressed 2 fingers lightly against her vocal sacs, tracing the anatomy of her own voice. She looked at Silas's thin, frail, unarmored neck. She looked at the blood pooling in the corner of his mouth. She understood. She saw the physical price he was paying to force his primitive biology to mold to her language. The queen lowered her hand. She leaned down, bringing her massive face mere inches from Silas's. The smell of crushed mint and wet earth was overpowering. When she spoke, she didn't project her voice to the room. She kept it soft, a low, rumbling purr that vibrated directly against Silas's chest cavity. She used the high court dialect. Nra, voshk, tar. Silas closed his eyes. The translation clicked perfectly into place in his mind. The structure was flawless. How long? She asked. Have you been listening in the dark? Silas swallowed the blood in his mouth. He braced his jaw, tightened his stomach, and prepared to answer. The war of the machines was over. The war of words had just begun. Silas tasted the copper pooling behind his teeth. It was a thick, heavy flavor, slipping down his throat and making his stomach churn. His lungs burned, demanding oxygen he couldn't afford to give them, not while holding his diaphragm locked in the rigid posture required for Castorian speech. The queen's massive face remained inches from his. Her breath smelled of crushed minerals and dry heat washing over his sweat-dampened hair. She was waiting for his answer. He swallowed the blood. He forced his jaw back into that agonizing, unnatural offset. Vresh, kal. 4 cycles. He didn't stop there. He couldn't. If he only gave her a fragment, she might categorize him as a parrot, a clever animal mimicking a trick. He had to show her he understood the architecture of their grief. Karan. Listen. Karan. Hear the iron fall. Hear the brood leaders burn at Red Hill. Hear the ships crack in the dark. He used the low, guttural roll for burn, a word strictly reserved for the cremation of honored dead, never for tactical destruction. It was a calculated risk. He was telling her that he hadn't just intercepted their military chatter. He had listened to their funeral rites over the static. The Queen's mandibles parted slightly, a microscopic shudder rippling through the heavy armor plates along her jawline. Behind her, the adjutant made a sharp, panicked, clicking sound. It was an instinctive reaction to blasphemy. A dirty, unarmored primate was using holy verbs. The adjutant reached for the heavy kinetic pistol at its hip. The Queen didn't even turn her head. She simply raised 2 fingers of her left hand. The gesture was sharp, silent, and absolute. The adjutant froze, its hand trembling millimeters from its holster. The Queen slowly straightened up, her joints popping with a deep, resonant sequence of clicks that echoed like snapping timber. She looked down at Silas, then slowly turned her vast black eyes toward the spherical translation drone still humming in the air near the dais. She pointed at it. Cash rock. Silence the iron. The handler, the same massive brute who had dislocated Miller's shoulder, stepped forward. It didn't power the drone down. It didn't press a button. It simply swung its heavy, chitin-plated arm in a brutal, horizontal arc. The backhand struck the drone with the sound of a sledgehammer hitting an empty oil drum. The metal casing crumpled instantly. Sparks violently spat across the dim antechamber as the drone was launched into the basalt wall, shattering into jagged shards of silicon, copper wire, and plastic. The dull, irritating whir of its internal cooling fans died immediately. The sudden absence of the machine's noise left the room feeling cavernous and hollow. Miller, still curled on the floor, let out a choked, terrified sob. The destruction of the drone severed his only tether to reality. He didn't know what Silas had said. He just knew the aliens had destroyed the only thing capable of brokering their surrender. "Hayes," Miller wheezed, his voice a pathetic, reedy scrape against the stone floor. "Hayes, what did you do? God, what did you say to them?" Silas didn't look at him. He kept his eyes fixed on the Queen. He knew if he broke eye contact, he would lose the fragile, invisible thread of authority he had just spun out of thin air. "Stay flat, David," Silas whispered in English, his voice ragged, leaking blood over his bottom lip. "Don't move. Don't speak." The Queen tilted her head, observing the brief exchange of English. To her ears, the human language must have sounded terribly flat, a sequence of soft, breathy noises devoid of the deep, percussive authority of her own tongue. It was the sound of wind over dead leaves. No wonder they had thought humanity was soulless. To a species whose entire social hierarchy was built on the physical resonance of their voices, the flat, digitized translations spit out by the human AI would have sounded like the mindless screeching of infected insects. The machines hadn't just mistranslated the words, they had stripped the humanity from the humans. For 4 years, they had been fighting a war of absolute extermination because the Castorians genuinely believed they were clearing out a pest infestation. The Queen took another step, circling Silas slowly. The heavy, rhythmic thud of her footsteps vibrated up through his ruined kneecaps. "Your biology is soft," the Queen rumbled, speaking in the high court dialect, projecting her voice just enough for the walls to catch the vibration. "Your carapace is absent. You bleed when you shape the words of the unbroken. Why?" Silas closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, fighting a wave of dizziness. The adrenaline was starting to metabolize, leaving behind a cold, hollow exhaustion. He had to be precise. He had to explain the failure of 2 entire species without sounding like he was making an excuse. He braced his hands against his thighs, forcing his spine straight. He pulled his tongue back, restricted his airflow, and prepared to tear his throat open again. "Because our iron lied to us. Sovereign," Silas ground out, the syllables feeling like sandpaper swallowing nails. "And your iron lied to you. We spoke in the dark, and the machines gave you static. You thought us empty. We thought you deaf." He paused, spitting a bright red string of saliva onto the dark stone beside his boot. The Queen watched the blood hit the floor. "I bleed," Silas continued, pushing the resonance deep into his chest, forcing the sorrowful, rolling tone into the consonants, because the truth is heavier than the silence. The Queen stopped her slow circling. She stood directly in front of him again, a towering monument of scarred chitin and predatory biology. The smell of oxidized copper, the scent of her irritation, was completely gone. In its place was the dense, heavy odor of wet ash. It was the smell of Castorian grief. The chamber remained suffocatingly still. The guards along the walls had completely forgotten their military discipline. Their heavy rifles drooped toward the floor, their heads tilted in a posture of profound, unsettling confusion. The universe, as they knew it, had fractured. The Queen looked at the blood staining Silas's chin. She looked at Miller, broken and weeping quietly on the floor. Then she looked past them both, toward the massive iron doors that led out into the ruined atmosphere of the human world. "The pact of subjugation is drawn," she said, her voice dropping into a slower, heavier cadence. It wasn't an order. It was a statement of legal reality. The soil is taken. The fleets are ash. What right does a bleeding mouth have to refuse the yoke? Silas's heart hammered against his ribs. This was the precipice. He wasn't a diplomat. He didn't know how to negotiate trade routes or border delineations. He only knew syntax. He knew how this species thought, how they valued pain, and how they despised cowardice. He couldn't beg. Pity did not exist in the Castorian lexicon. There was no word for it. The closest approximation was wasted meat. He had to offer her something better than subjugation. He had to offer her dignity. Silas gritted his teeth, shifting his weight off his numb right leg. He pushed himself up. Instantly, a dozen kinetic rifles snapped up, the sharp clack-clack of charging mechanisms echoing through the hall. Miller screamed, burying his head in his good arm. Silas ignored the weapons. He ignored the handler twitching toward him. He stood up, fully exposing his frail, unarmored chest to the room. His legs shook violently. He was a head shorter than the handler, and practically a child next to the Queen, but he locked his knees and forced his shoulders back. He looked the Queen in her fathomless black eyes. "A yoke is for beasts," Silas snapped, using the sharp, clipping prefix that denoted deep insult. He didn't care if the guards shot him. He was too tired to care. "Beasts do not speak the High Court. Beasts do not bleed for the honor of the syntax. You have broken our ships. You have burned our fields. But if you put the iron collar on our necks, you do not gain a servant. You insult your own victory by ruling over silence." He took a slow, painful breath, his chest rattling. "Leave us the ash, sovereign. Leave us the dirt. We will bury our dead, and you will bury yours. But we will not wear the iron." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. The adjutant on the dais was practically vibrating out of its armor. A prisoner of war had just dictated terms to the sovereign. By every law of the Castorian caste system, Silas should have been ripped into pieces so small they could be washed down the floor drains. The Queen stared at him. She stared at this fragile, broken creature in a filthy uniform, trembling from the effort of simply standing upright, yet demanding sovereignty through a blood-soaked throat. Slowly, the semi-transparent membrane slid back across her eyes. She reached up with her heavy right hand. For a terrifying second, Silas thought she was going to backhand him the way the handler had destroyed the drone. He braced himself, refusing to close his eyes. Instead, the Queen pressed her thumb and forefinger against her own chest plate, right over the central respiratory vent. Clack, clack. She tapped the armor twice. Silas's breath hitched. It was the gesture of the equal measure, a battlefield salute given only to commanders who had held a line until the last drop of blood was spent. She lowered her hand. "The dirt is yours, Speaker," the Queen rumbled, her voice dropping so low Silas felt it in his teeth. "Keep your broken world. Rebuild your hives. But tell your brood to burn their machines. If the air between us is to be crossed again, it will be crossed with blood, not static." She didn't wait for him to acknowledge it. The Castorians didn't do drawn-out farewells. A truth was spoken, a truth was accepted, and the physical world simply realigned to match it. The Queen turned her massive back to him. The heavy chitin plates of her armor shifted with a sound like grinding tectonic plates. She walked toward the dais, dismissing his existence entirely. The guards along the walls immediately stood down, snapping their rifles flush against their chests. The handler stepped aside, leaving a clear, unobstructed path to the heavy iron doors at the end of the hall. Silas stood there for a moment, swaying on his feet. The metallic taste in his mouth was overwhelming. The throbbing in his molar felt like a localized earthquake in his skull. He looked down at Miller. The Major was staring up at him, pale, sweaty, and completely devoid of comprehension. "Get up, David," Silas rasped in English. His normal voice sounded incredibly weak and thin after forcing the Castorian dialect. "We're going home." "What?" Miller choked out, clutching his hanging arm. "What did they say? Are they executing us outside?" Silas reached down, grabbing Miller by the webbing of his tactical vest, and hauled him awkwardly to his feet. Miller groaned in agony, leaning heavily against Silas's shoulder. "No," Silas said softly, turning them both toward the massive exit. The air in front of them smelled faintly of ozone and outside rain. "She just realized we aren't dogs. Come on, walk." They hobbled together down the long basalt corridor. The alien guards didn't look at them. They didn't track them with their weapons. They simply let them pass, ignoring them with the profound, respectful indifference given to recognized neighbors. Silas pushed against the heavy iron door. It gave way with a screech of rusted hinges, letting in the pale, gray light of the ruined human colony outside. The sky was thick with ash, and the distant silhouettes of shattered skyscrapers stood like jagged teeth against the horizon. It was a broken, dying world, but as Silas stepped out into the cold wind, tasting the ash on his bloody tongue, he knew they would survive it. He spat a final mouthful of blood onto the crushed concrete. He didn't feel like a savior. He just felt like a tired man who had finally, painstakingly, learned how to ask for silence. If you felt the raw, bloody weight of Silas's sacrifice and the terrifying awe of the Queen's realization, don't let the story end here. Hit that like button to support more grounded, gritty sci-fi storytelling. Share this video with a friend who loves deep, character-driven HFY drama, and make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next sci-fi epic. Drop a comment below. Would you have dared to speak to the Queen?